So there are other studies other than slavery, studies like Wayne Urban's, which focuses on regions, particularly the South, in the case of Urban and Wagner. They're more explicit attention in the South and how that particular educational experience can shed light on wider experiences. So we see that increasingly in educational history today. So for Urban, for example, the importance of storytelling, narrative forms, Southern fundamentalist Christianity in the South, and possibilities of using them elsewhere. If you notice, a lot of where they're going with the work, it's not explicitly deconstruction, but you can see how sort of deconstruction seeps in to some of the moves that they make in this work. There's also increasingly a movement away from the notion that Europeans brought education to America and that indigenous people lacked commitments of their own to teaching and learning, right? So here you notice that there's an effort to move beyond binaries, right? So there's an interpretive alternative in American educational history when dealing with Indians, where you have some writers talking about sort of the assimilationist impact of education on Indians, and you have others that talk about sort of the extinction as well as sort of cultural erasure and so forth and so on. Now, the tacit assumption behind all of this becomes that Indians never confronted sort of ecological, military, or economic shocks prior to the arrival of Europeans, that they were frozen in time prior to their arrival. And so this has been problematic. So when you have, for example, David Wallace Adams writing a book called Education for Extinction, one of the main critiques of works like that is, look, boarding schools were bad for Native Americans, but at least Europeans brought schools or education to Native Americans, right? And it becomes very hard for a person like Adams to sort of defend that, or anyone else who would have sort of a radical critique of what happened in that time frame, because they're not mining history far enough back to say that, look, prior to the arrival of Europeans, education was going on. So increasingly, educational historians are looking, for example, to the Chronicles of Hernando de Soto, which was the first sustained encounter between Europeans and indigenous people of the United States. So looking at these chronicles to look at Native American commitments to education. So the fact that having a commitment to education prior to the arrival of Europeans it's impossible for us not to think that they had a commitment, because if you look, for example, at humankind's greatest feat of genetic engineering, which is Indians' process of seed selection and cross-fertilization that led to the invention of maize, there had to be deep forms of education there. If you look at guerrilla tactics against invading Europeans, this again signifies institutionalized commitments to intentional teaching and learning, not too different from what goes on at West Point. So there's some research pointing to the Appalachian contact with the Aztec Empire. So chances are good that they heard or witnessed Aztec compulsory schooling. The institution's qualified as one of the world's earliest public education systems. So clearly, education policy entered the history well before Thomas Jefferson. Okay. Eileen Tamura, who's writing in 1994, also researched an American of Japanese ancestry, and she writes about value messages delivered through legal structures and organization of the camps, the internment camps in World War II, the experiences of people who were forced to live in them, and the fact of incarceration itself, right? So she looks at education, again, beyond actual schools in the camps and sort of the wider pedagogical interactions and learning interactions that went on in the very process of establishing these camps. And then you have radical gender studies and queer theories, which are advancing new knowledge on the media, in the social construction of masculinity, as educative projects, as well as industrialization in the process of encoding normative bodies and sexualities. I mean, these are all very important today. Of course, this list is not exhaustive. It's an invitation not only to fill the gaps, but to sort of rethink what goes on in the field. I hope that this presentation was useful.